Good morning, everyone. Thank you very much, Creative Mornings Indianapolis, for the opportunity to be here. Thank you to Ryan for the invitation and to Devin Jen for making the connection. I'm very excited to be here. I also am very excited that my lovely wife, Michelle Freeman, is here with me today, and that doesn't always happen. We don't often get to see our spouses do their professional thing, so thank you, babe, for coming. The month of March seems to be very confused as to whether or not it wants to stay in winter or transition into spring. But there's one thing that I'm not confused about, and that it's a wonderful moment to be in this building on this day to share this story and 100-year-old legacy of a woman named Madam C.J. Walker and how she can influence all of our lives right now. I just want to say, skipped ahead a little bit here. I left the E off of Madam because that's the way she spelled it. I know there are a lot of creative people who are used to watching copy and proofreading. I didn't want to get dinged from the beginning, so I wanted to state that up front. How many of you have heard of Madam Walker before today? Okay, good. How many of you have been inside this building before today? All right, great. Well, your theme for the month of March is courage. And the Creative Mornings website has the following statement about courage. Courage has nothing to do with your title or level of expertise. It's not for the few or the gifted. It's an act of humanity, of choosing to take an action that is risky because it demands vulnerability and curiosity. Courage has no specific form and knows no bounds. From starting a side project to the act of listening when you would rather interject, every day we are wrapped in opportunities to exercise courage. Now, I'm a scholar of philanthropy, and I've studied Madam Walker's generosity through her philanthropic giving. As I contemplated your theme, it occurred to me that I could take the same statement and replace the word courage with generosity, and it would still hold true. So let's take a look at that. Generosity has nothing to do with your title or level of expertise. It's not for the few or the gifted. It's an act of humanity, of choosing to take an action that is risky because it demands vulnerability and curiosity. Generosity has no specific form and knows no bounds. From starting a side project to the act of listening when you would rather interject, every day we are wrapped in opportunities to exercise generosity. My friends, this is exactly the lesson that I learned by doing research on Madam C.J. Walker and philanthropy in communities of color at the turn of the 20th century. And so today I want to share with you the topic, how to live a courageously generous life. How to live a courageously generous life, courtesy of Madam C.J. Walker. Your website uses the following words to describe courage: vulnerability, risk, curiosity, empathy, and action. These very words describe Madam C.J. Walker, both in terms of her courage and her generosity. She was born Sarah Breedlove 2 days before Christmas in 1867 on a sugar plantation in Delta, Louisiana. Her parents and siblings had been enslaved, but she was the first freeborn person in her family. They all lived together under the post-Civil War and post-emancipation historical era we now know as Reconstruction. 4 million black people were now free. African Americans were elected to Congress and state legislatures, and for the first time, according to historians, America was actually a biracial democracy. But that hope didn't last long. Within 12 years, the angry white South took their country back. They reversed the gains that were made and set the country on a path towards Jim Crow segregation of the races. During this time, tragedy struck young Sarah's life. Her mother died a few years after her birth, and shortly thereafter, her father died. She found herself under the care of her older sister and brother-in-law, moving around the South in search of opportunity. She began working in her early teens to help the family out. She married and had a child. And then tragedy struck again. Her husband died. Jim Crow was emerging around her as well, as racial lynchings and other forms of terror were becoming commonplace. Before she was 21, Sarah was all three of the most vulnerable populations described in the Bible. She was poor, she was an orphan, and she was a widow. She was also black and female in the emerging Jim Crow South. In terms of risk, Sarah took a risk. She picked up her toddler and headed north, arriving in St. Louis, where her brothers were. She was aided by the St. Paul's African Methodist Episcopal Church, where women in the church embraced her and helped get her daughter into school, and both of them to get settled. These women were educated. They were civic business leaders. They were speaking truth to power in St. Louis and working hard to not only spread the gospel of their faith, but to make the city a hospitable place for the poor black migrants who were arriving in droves. In terms of curiosity, these women helped to feed Sarah's curiosity. They helped her get into night school. There were no provisions for education for Sarah in Louisiana, but she jumped at the opportunity to learn, a theme that would carry throughout Madam Walker's life. She became a voracious reader, and she was known to sit in her office every morning, read the paper, and to ask her office staff to help her with words she didn't know. During this time, Sarah was working as a washerwoman, which was grueling, back-breaking work. She began to wonder, though, if there was a better life for her, how to create it. She became curious if there was a better way. Empathy during this time, Sarah was struggling and dreaming. She served in the church's ministries, and she began helping people. She raised money. She collected food for sick people in the neighborhood. She was part of the church's social programs and social safety net. But wait, she's poor, she's a widow, she's an orphan. She's not supposed to be helping, she's supposed to be helped. But what does your website say? Here we go. We'll get there. Courage or generosity have nothing to do with the title or level of expertise. It's not for the few or the gifted. It's an act of humanity, of choosing to take an action. In the midst of her own suffering and struggle, Sarah became a donor, giving, depositing into the lives of others because she knew and empathized with their struggle, and she recognized her responsibility to others. In terms of action, Sarah's vulnerability, risk-taking, curiosity, and empathy culminated in taking action. Sarah long had problems with her hair. Her hair was unhealthy and it was falling out due to overall problems with sanitation in urban cities during this time frame, but also the nature of this backbreaking work as a washerwoman. One night, Sarah reported that she had a dream in which a large black man appeared before her and solved her hair troubles by giving her a recipe for an ointment that would heal her scalp and promote hair growth. Sarah wasted no time. She left St. Louis and headed to Denver, Colorado in search of opportunity and began developing her product. Well, during this time, Sarah met and married a man named Charles Joseph, CJ, Walker. While in Denver, she began promoting the products under the name Madam CJ Walker, and the rest, as they say, is history. Now, that's the quick version of the story how Sarah Breedlove, who was born in this shack on a slave plantation in Delta, Louisiana, worked as a washerwoman, created a product, and became Madam C.J. Walker, the internationally known millionaire entrepreneur and philanthropist, who later died in her own $250,000 34-room mansion that she built in New York, where her neighbor was Mr. John D. Rockefeller. That house still stands today, by the way. My friends, that's not supposed to happen. That was not Jim Crow's plan for Sarah Breedlove. That was not Jim Crow's plan for any African American. She thwarted the system by using its own absurdities against itself. But that's just the story of her courage, the courage to not listen to what society said about her as a black woman, the courage to believe in her own value and humanity despite society's denial of the same, the courage to push back against society's boundaries and restrictions on her life and carve out a space for herself and for women just like her. There's more to it, though. What about her generosity? This is where our own Indianapolis comes into play. Madam Walker moved to Indianapolis in 1910. She came because the local black community rolled out the red carpet for her during an earlier visit, and she felt welcome and at home. Also, just as we think of Indiana now as the crossroads of America, back then she thought the logistics and transportation infrastructure would be very important and helpful for her mail order business. She set down roots and built a factory and a house. She incorporated her business and hired a local black attorney named Freeman B. Ransom, who had studied law at Columbia, as her corporate manager. Ransom gave form and function to Walker's energy and ideas, and together they built an empire that grew to include a reportedly 20,000 sales agents around the country and overseas. She became part of the local Indianapolis community. She was a member of Bethel AME Church, which is down the street. She donated $1,000 to help build the colored YMCA here in Indianapolis, which was a few blocks from here. She made other donations to organizations like the Alpha Old Folks Home, to Flanner House, both of which exist to this day. She gave to the local NAACP chapter and to black colleges and schools across the South. Here in Indianapolis, she bought a wheelchair for a physically disabled person. She bought train tickets to help people who were estranged from their families to get reconnected with them in other states. And every Christmas, one of the main events in town was Madam Walker's food drive. She gave away hundreds of turkeys and food items to people in this neighborhood. In fact, there was so much food donated that the local newspaper reported that the Walker factory looked like a supermarket as people were filling baskets with turkeys, fruits, and vegetables. But Madam Walker's generosity was not limited to money or food. Back to your website, generosity has no specific form and knows no bounds. Madam Walker opened a network of schools, beauty schools around the country, and became a major educational provider who enabled thousands of black women to earn a credential, gain employment, and provide for their families against the wishes of Jim Crow. She aspired to build a school in Africa to do the same. She organized her sales agents into clubs and encouraged them to not only sell products, but to do charity work in their communities around the country, to be courageously generous. And they responded. Walker agents raised money for organizations. They donated furniture to organizations. They volunteered their time at local events. And collectively, they raised their voices against lynchings and demanded that President Woodrow Wilson take action to end the deadly practice. In trying to understand this brand of generosity, I was led to an important moment in 1914 while Madam was living here in Indianapolis. Walker was a big fan of Booker T. Washington. He was the head of Tuskegee Institute, a black industrial school in Alabama, and he was the preeminent black leader of the era. She had donated money to his school before, and she had talked to him about making another gift. She wanted to give a $300 donation for scholarships for 5 students and to support general operations. Believe it or not, that would have covered tuition back then for 5 people, right? If you could believe that, Walker was just really excited about the gift. And remember, she was denied an education herself, so it's very important. Well, Washington replied to her in a manner that suggested $300 was not enough for his taste. Could she send more? Walker got his letter, and she was confused, and she was very irritated with him. So she started to write back and give him a piece of her mind. She told him that this was not what they had talked about when they met before during a visit to the campus, that he'd made it seem that $300 would be helpful, but now he was changing his tune. And she said, yes, her company was successful and it was growing, but so were her expenses. And she said, while I wish to give you thousands of dollars, right now I can only do hundreds. Then she said this to him: I am unlike your white friends who have waited until they were rich and then help, but have in proportion to my success, I have reached out and am helping others. When I read this, I smiled because in one sentence, Madam Walker summarized not only her specific approach to giving, but the whole history of generosity in the African American community, and a highly accessible pathway that any one of us, regardless of race, gender, or wealth, can follow to live a courageously generous life. So let's unpack this a little bit. Who were Washington's white friends? Andrew Carnegie, John D. Rockefeller, and many of the titans of industry were all major donors to Tuskegee and had given him millions of dollars. They were also on his board of directors. They had spent their adult lives accumulating their wealth, and then later in old age, dedicated themselves to giving much of that wealth away as philanthropists. It's certainly tempting to compare Walker to Carnegie. After all, he was the archetypal philanthropist of the era. His generosity literally changed the landscape of America and continues to do good today. From Bill and Melinda Gates to other members of the Billionaire Giving Pledge Club that you've probably heard of, Carnegie's influence continues to reverberate over 100 years later. But the comparison is problematic because Walker emerges either as a great exemplar of his philosophy of wealth, because she too felt a responsibility to use her affluence to help the less fortunate, or she's a poor contrast because her own giving was an infinitesimal fraction of Carnegie's giving. However, Walker's sense of obligation did not originate with her acquisition of wealth. It was inculcated and acted upon earlier in life when she had meager resources, barely any. Remember when she was helping people in St. Louis? Or maybe we turn to New York's Olivia Sage, the prototypical female donor of the period, to contextualize Walker. Both were wealthy female philanthropists, contemporaries who used their wealth to support social and educational causes. But while they shared the same gender, they had starkly different historical experiences. Women like Sage needed either their husband's permission or inheritances after their death to live out their generosity to the fullest. Madam Walker was married 3 times, and let me tell you, she did not care one bit what any of her 3 husbands thought about her generosity. As a woman, she created the wealth rather than inherited the wealth that helped her rise out of poverty. Furthermore, she was still black and female, a combination that's very distinctive in American history. So Washington's friends don't provide much context for understanding Walker's generosity. At the end of the sentence, Walker said, "In proportion to my success, I have reached out and am helping others." I love this statement for its simplicity, and it's the basis for what I have called her gospel of giving. Here we go. With that simple statement, she declared how all of us here today can live a courageously generous life. Now, what is her gospel of giving? Give as you can to be helpful to others. This is a gradual, incremental approach to generosity, which says that anyone, regardless of how much money you have, can be a donor, can give, can help. Sarah first gave to others as a poor, orphaned widow migrant trying to help her neighbors. The focus here on others is important too. Traditional Western models of giving say that there should be distance between the people we give to, between the giver and the recipient, to distinguish between altruistic motives and family or legal responsibilities. But Madam Walker made no distinction in such giving between gifts to family or gifts to strangers or gifts to neighbors. Her generosity knew no bounds. Spare no useful means to be helpful to others. This says that there are multiple channels for giving and generosity. There are monetary and non-monetary gifts to make. The opportunity for employment provided by the Walker Company to black men and women whom Jim Crow denied the dignity of meaningful and gainful work was a gift. The education enabled by Walker schools or Walker scholarships was a gift. The pride in personal appearance afforded by using beauty products tailored to the needs of women of color in a segregated economy that ignored this market was a gift. The inspirational words from Madam Walker's public speeches, which lifted the spirits of people daily discouraged and battered by the brutalities of Jim Crow, was a gift. The collective voices of Walker and her agents, speaking truth about lynchings, was a gift to this nation in search of its conscience. Madam Walker even said her 34-room mansion belonged to the entire African American race and dedicated its use for organizations to conduct meetings and to strategize and develop protests to overcome inequality. There are many different types of philanthropic resources that can comprise a courageously generous life. And lastly, give more as your means increase to help others. Wealth is merely an accelerator of giving, not the impetus for it. Give what you can, and as you acquire more money, more time, more talent, more resources, more influence, give more. So the answer to the question, how to live a courageously generous life, is to give along the way. Don't wait. Do what you can with what you have now. As my uncle, the Reverend Roscoe D. Cooper of Richmond, Virginia says, what you have is more important than what you don't have, because you'll never ever be judged on the basis of what you do with what you don't have, but on the basis of what you do with what you got. There's another way of saying this. If not me, who? If not now, when? If not here, where? We don't have to wait. We can be courageously generous right now. We don't have to wait until we've accumulated a certain amount of money. We don't have to wait until we retire and have more time. We can make a difference now and be exceedingly abundantly and courageously generous in the process. You say, okay, Dr. Freeman, I get it, but I don't know where to start. What should I do? Well, I submit to you that part of the answer is in this photo. This is Madam Walker in one of her cars. She loved her cars. At face value, this was certainly a luxury. And add to that the fact that she had 2 other cars and a chauffeur. She was ballin'. But Madam Walker was known for riding into town and taking people, friends, strangers off the street for rides, out of sheer hospitality and generosity of sharing the experience of being in a car, which many people never had. This photo also illustrates something else, the concept of proximity, which is defined as physical, social, or psychological nearness to individuals being helped, a type of nearness that gives firsthand information about problems, issues, and needs. Walker had proximity to the people and communities she helped. She did not separate herself from them. She couldn't. No matter how much money Walker had, she was still black and still female in Jim Crow America. She could never fully escape the resulting conditions of legalized discrimination and was thus in as much need for freedom and equality as any African American at the time. This car symbolizes that tension. It enabled her to avoid the indignities of Jim Crow travel on segregated trains. But as she literally drove all over the country, one wrong turn down the wrong road, and she could become strange fruit. While wealth completely rescued Andrew Carnegie from the severe poverty of his youth, Walker could never fully escape the racial and gender oppression without major societal transformation and change. So all of Walker's generosity harkened back to gifts she once needed herself. She empathized with others, and she knew the need firsthand. Because of this, she didn't live a compartmentalized life where her charity was separate from her business, which was separate from her family, separated from friends or community. No, it was integrated. Her generosity knew no bounds. She donated to organizations and she ran her company in a very progressive manner. She advocated for public policy changes in Washington, D.C., and she gave food to neighbors down the street. She formally educated people through her own schools, and she gave a positive word to the young women she encountered during her travel tours. Wherever an opportunity arose to be helpful and generous, Madam Walker became, as one local newspaper reported, the unfolding woman growing at the approach, not receding, getting smaller in all ways, as so many people do. She welcomed the opportunity to give. And the key to living a courageously generous life is for us to do the same. So will you be generous with yourself and all you have to offer this world, Creative Mornings? Right now, someone needs a good word from you that will encourage their spirits. Right now, someone needs time to help meet an important deadline. Right now, there's a petition that needs to be signed, a story that needs to be told, tears that need to be wiped, a burden to be unloaded. There are stomachs that need to be filled and hearts that need to be healed. There are children in need of direction and art in need of expression. There are many ways to serve and give of yourself. The question is, do you have the courage to do it? Do we have the courage to do it? Per your website, are we willing to be vulnerable, to take a risk, to be curious, to have empathy, and to take action? 2019 will mark the 100th anniversary of Madam Walker's death. It's very exciting to note that the theater just received a $15 million grant from the Lilly Endowment for a complete renovation into a state-of-the-art educational, artistic, and entrepreneurial center. We hope Creative Mornings Indianapolis will return and regularly use the facility for your meetings and for exhibits and for other gatherings. Also, NBA superstar LeBron James and Oscar Award-winning actress Octavia Spencer recently announced that they are creating a Netflix-based miniseries about Madam Walker's life. 100 years later, Madam Walker, as her great-great-granddaughter Amelia Bundles says, is reasserting herself. As Hoosiers, when we courageously give of ourselves to help others, we are Madam Walker's legacy, and she is our heritage. And so I urge you to consider how you can live a courageously generous life by giving what you can, to help whomever you can, sparing no useful means, and giving more as your means increase. And I leave you with this poem, which was said to be Madam Walker's favorite. Lord, help me to live from day to day in such a self-forgetful way that when I kneel down to pray, my prayer shall be for others. Help me in all the work I do to ever be sincere and true, and know that all I do for you must needs done for others. Thank you.